Sometimes, people we love get sick, inevitably getting weaker with age and eventually passing away. The lucky ones live a long life and die surrounded by loved ones, although oftentimes death comes far more suddenly than that, and without any sort of warning. On these occasions, we are left to deal with all that we could but never did say, of all we could have but never did do. Death itself usually comes unannounced. Whether it be sudden or slow, it is always without fanfare. But what if there was a way in which we could receive a warning, a premonition of sorts that let us know that this passing was soon approaching? Some say there are those out there with specific lineages who would receive such warning if only they were to stop and listen. A long, drawn-out cry in the night, full of sorrow and despair. A voice that doesn't speak, but still somehow tells you everything you need to know. A sound that lingers in the air, marking a passing before death has even arrived. My name is Luke Mordew, and this urban legend is the Banshee. Grief is a strange and complicated emotion that many have tried to understand over the years. Psychologists have mapped out its stages, philosophers have questioned its purpose, and still, the only consistent conclusion we've reached is that grief is in no way linear. It doesn't arrive in a neat sequence, and it doesn't leave on schedule. For some, it softens with time, whilst for others, it lingers beneath the surface for the rest of their lives, occasionally rising to the surface without warning. Research shows that grief isn't just emotional, and that it also manifests itself physically. It quite literally changes our body chemistry, altering how we sleep, how we think, how we hear and feel the world around us. It sharpens some senses whilst dulling others, and in the midst of all of this, time itself loses shape with each day blurring into one. Even familiar surroundings can feel strange in grief. A room you've sat in 1,000 times suddenly feels unfamiliar. You may find yourself forgetting what day it is, or struggling to complete tasks that once came naturally. For some, it feels as though you're walking through water, slow, heavy, and detached from the rhythm of the world around you, although it is during this time, in this altered state, that some believe we are more susceptible to things outside of our world, with some suggesting that this susceptibility will arise before the passing has even occurred, opening us up to signs we may have previously missed, or songs we may have previously not heard. In my telling of an encounter with the Banshee, we will follow Neve, looking after her sister who is battling pneumonia after falling through the ice. A howl whistled down the streets outside as the air whooshed through the bitter cold of the winter night. The thin glass on the windows was slowly fogging as a film of ice began to creep its way from each corner. Every item in the room seemed to dance in the shadow, lit by the flickering flames of the many candles that filled it, trying to create as much warmth as possible, although no matter how much they tried, the room seemed to still be growing colder. It was as if Melanie herself was emitting a cold breeze into the room with every breath that she took. Her skin hadn't yet regained its peachy complexion since the incident had occurred. Neve sat on the armchair across the room, watching her sleeping sister with concern in her eyes. She had never experienced fear like that before, watching her little sister fall through the frozen lake. In an instant, they had gone from playful banter to horrifying screams as she scrambled forward to yank her from the lake's icy grip. For the first couple of days, she was convinced her sister wasn't going to make it, but luckily for them all, she was still young and fit. Neve shot up as Melanie suddenly lunged forward, violently coughing into her hand. It was the most energy Neve had seen her have all day, and it was likely to exhaust her throughout the night. The door instantly flung open as her mum paced inside, quickly attending to her daughter, handing her a glass of water to help ease the discomfort. By now, Neve had gotten to her feet, gripping the frame at the bottom of the bed as she nervously watched on. Melanie drank the water and laid back down, acknowledging neither her or her mother, as if she wasn't even aware they were beside her. Her mum turned to Neve and gave her a smile, the first she had managed to muster since the accident had taken place, and whispered that they should let her rest. Neve wasn't doing anything to disturb her sister and wanted to fight for the right to stay. But she also knew that deep down she was responsible as she was older, and it was under her watch this took place. Not wanting to rock the boat too much, she simply nodded her head and left the room. That night, Neve did the same as she had done for the past few days, staring up at the ceiling, trying all her might to listen to each crackled breath that emitted from her sister's room. At times, she questioned whether she could hear her at all, sometimes wondering if she was hallucinating or mixing up her own breathing with her sister's. Either way, it comforted her to know that she could still hear Melanie alive and resting. Although tonight, something else had begun to fill the air with it. She was used to hearing the sounds of the many owls and foxes that ventured through the streets outside, although what she could hear tonight was unfamiliar. Finally, she had taken her mind away from her sister's breaths as she slowly climbed out of bed, still wrapping her duvet around her like a thick blanket as she peered out of the frosted window. There was nothing she could see, and yet she could not shake this feeling that there was, in fact, something out there. The sound that it emitted was somewhat soothing. It was somber, low and hollow, yet strong. This was not the whistle of the wind that she had previously thought it to be. It was almost as if it was the long groan of someone in the depths of grief. The sound of a wooden drawer slamming shut instantly brought Neve back to reality, followed by the many rumblings of items rolling across the floor. She paced out of her bedroom and into Melanie's, finding that her lamp was now switched on, with her drawer completely taken out of the bedside cabinet and now resting on her lap. On the floor, several items had fallen, with hair ties, used batteries, and an old comb now scattered across the aging carpet. "What are you doing?" Neve asked as she paced inside, instantly yanking the drawer from her hands. "I was looking for my bracelet," Melanie replied through a shortened breath, her eyes filled with tears. Neve paused, thinking on where it could be, hoping that it was somewhere inside. "It fell off in the lake," Melanie added, as a tear dripped down her face, warming her cold skin a little bit more. This bracelet was a gift Melanie had received from her father for her 15th birthday the year before, 2 months before he passed away. Neve sighed, sliding the drawer back into its slots as Melanie slumped back into her pillow, each breath a little too quick and a little too shallow, as if the air itself was too much for her to bear. Neve wanted to tell her she could find it, but she knew that was extremely unlikely. And so instead, she turned it into a reason to fight through, telling her that they would go and find it once it got warmer and she was feeling better. However, Melanie's tired mind had seemingly drifted away by now, staring into nothingness ahead, still awake, but as if she was in the midst of a dream. Neve didn't want to disturb her any further, and so she reached out and flicked off the lamp. But as she turned to her one last time, she saw Melanie's eyes watching her in the moonlight, her pale, purple lips quivering as if she was about to speak. "Do you hear her?" she asked, staring deep into Neve's eyes. "Hear who?" Neve asked, only half answering to avoid getting into anything too heavy right now. "The Banshee." Neve paused, studying her sister's delusional state with concern. She needed her to get better, and if she's hallucinating the sounds of a banshee, then perhaps she was beginning to let go. You see, according to what their dad had told them, certain families will be visited by a small, ominous woman who will weep for days until the time comes where a loved one dies. Being amongst the O'Dowd family meant that they were said to be one of these families, although, as with all their ancestral legends, it was nothing but folklore and was told to them as such. That said, this wasn't the first time that Melanie had brought up the cries of the Banshee, as she had also once claimed to have heard her the day before the passing of their father. She was tired, feverish, and only half awake, so Neve didn't take it too seriously, especially as she watched her slowly fade back into slumber moments after saying it. That being said, the strange weeping-like sounds that echoed through the cold air outside was not forgotten, and the idea that perhaps there was more truth to this than they had expected horrified her. The ice across the lake seemed even thicker than before, as Neve stood over it the following day, staring down in its murky waters as if confronting a dark force that had almost dented her family even further. She felt conflicted, almost guilty for the feelings she had. She was never going to step out into the waters again, that much was for sure, but she could at least enjoy it from the edge. She still found the view enchanting, and nothing had changed in her desire to explore the countryside around her. She wanted to hate it. She wanted to never feel the urge to see it ever again, and yet once more she found herself at its edge, flicking stones across the ice, causing a loud whistle to swirl around her as it slid across its surface. She placed her feet by the water's edge, studying the marks in the ground where she dragged her sister from its depths just day before, a small sign of chaos, horror, and panic embedded amongst the now quiet and calm waters. But it was here, as she studied the scene of the crime, that she spotted something glistening in the ice. It was Melanie's bracelet. The odds of this were low, and the fact that it was still found within reach was almost unbelievable, and yet, with all that had happened, she was simply happy to finally have a win. The joy this would bring her sister would be incredible, perhaps even giving her an extra boost as she fought through her fever. It wasn't far away, and she could easily get to it if she just took a couple of steps out into the lake. Although, she wouldn't be so stupid, and so, instead, she gripped the branch of the thin tree behind her and leaned her body over the water. She reached out as far as she could, but still, she couldn't quite get her fingers to it. And so, she took a step forward, just slightly placing her foot on the edge of the ice. Even if she fell through here, she'd get nothing but a wet foot. Now, she could finally get it. gripping it firmly between her index finger and her thumb. She pulled at it, trying to force it from the ice in such a way that it would not break either the surface below or the bracelet itself. Although, without much effort at all, the bracelet came free. This would be a short-lived celebration, though, as the branch of the tree she was hanging on would give way due to her weight. It wasn't enough to snap in two, but it was enough to cause her to drop, resulting in her losing her footing and stumbling forward, slamming her hands and knees onto the ice. She froze, panicked for a moment, waiting for her body to stumble into the water, but thankfully, her body remained still on the thick, frozen ice below her. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel each pump in her temples and fingertips. Her breathing was short and frantic, her eyes darting around her as she slowly began to crawl forward, terrified to move too suddenly. Although, before she could get very far at all, she heard the sounds of movements in the trees ahead. She hoped it could have been her mum, or maybe even a passerby who could help. But for some reason, she did not open her mouth to call out. Something inside was telling her this was not the case, and that whoever this was were not here to help. This was confirmed all the more when the gentle, low hum of a woman's groan began to emit from the trees, slowly growing to a weep and a moan. She was crying, although it was as if her wailing was being released through song. It was then that Neve finally saw her, a short, frail-looking woman, her face draped in a grey veil. She was dark and shadowed as she slowly emerged from the trees, but Neve could already see that she was walking straight for her, watching as she cried. Neve's eyes filled with tears as the realization hit her. A cold shiver shot down her spine as she felt the snap of the ice below her palm, followed by the harsh crack of the ice below her knees. Before she could take a simple action, the ice had given way, and in an instant, Neve had disappeared under the lake's surface. Her body instantly hardened, and her muscles and joints stiffened, shocked by the sudden, intense cold that engulfed her. Her lungs instantly released air as she gasped, frantically waving her arms to break through the ice. Although now, she could not seem to find the opening she had just made. She slammed her hands against it, trying her hardest to break through, but unfortunately, this was no use. In her final moments, Neve looked up through the thick ice, pleading for someone to appear and save her, although all she could see was the veiled woman standing by the lake, wailing at her demise. Melanie was right. The Banshee had come to warn them of a passing to come. It was just that they had misunderstood which sister this warning was for. Just what the Banshee is remains somewhat ambiguous in folklore, with various interpretations claiming her as a ghost, spirit, or even fairy, depending entirely on the specific tradition surrounding it. The word Banshee derives from the Old Irish term Banshee, which reads more as Bean Sidhi, if you were going to read it in an English manner, translating roughly as Woman of the Fairy Mound, or simply fairy woman. The etymology of this word firmly connects the Banshee to Old Irish fairy folklore, especially connected to the supernatural inhabitants of the Sidhe. These are ancient burial mounds that can be found across the Irish landscape, although they are also said to be gateways to the other world. The variety in this has led to several names for the Banshee. However, there is agreement amongst etymologists and folklorists that originally her name meant woman of the other world. That said, she is known by many names. Hag of the Mist is a name that likely comes from early attempts to translate or interpret Irish descriptions of the Banshee into English. In some traditions, she is said to appear veiled or shrouded, her figure partly hidden by cloaks, hair, or even drifting mist. The idea of her arriving in this haze or mist ties into the belief that she comes from the other world, and that her presence isn't fully grounded in our physical realm. And while the phrase Hag of the Mist doesn't appear in any early Irish sources, it became a popular nickname in later retellings, especially in folklore collections and translations from the 19th and early 20th centuries. A lesser-known name that appears in some regional versions of the legend is Hag of the Black Head. This title is often thought to be a reference to the Banshee's appearance in certain forms, where she's described not as a pale or veiled woman, but as a dark, shadowy figure with a black hood or head covering. Like Hag of the Mist, this title isn't found in the earliest mythological texts, but emerged in later folklore and oral traditions, adding to the range of names used to describe her different forms. She is sometimes referred to as the Little Washerwoman, a name that comes from older Irish folklore, where spirits known as the Washers of the Ford were said to appear near rivers, washing blood-stained clothes or burial shrouds in the hours or days before a death. These figures were typically described as women, crouched at the water's edge, scrubbing garments that belonged to someone who hadn't yet died. In some versions of the legend, if you approached her, or if she caught you watching, she would actually name the person marked for death. Over time, as these older stories merged with the evolving image of the Banshee, the washerwoman became another form she could take, linking her not just to sound, but to sight as well. Interestingly, this version of the Banshee isn't unique to Ireland. Similar figures appear across other parts of Europe, where Celtic cultures once lived. In France, where the Gaulish Celts once thrived, there are stories of Les Lavandières, a trio of spectral washerwomen tied to death and fate. In Brittany, a Celtic region with linguistic ties to Welsh and Cornish, they appear as Canarized Nos, or night washers. On the Iberian Peninsula, where the Celtiberian once lived, you'll find several regional versions. Brujas Lebreas in parts of Portugal, Lavandière in Galicia, La Lavandière in Asturias, and Le Lavandière again in Cantabria. Each of these figures is tied to water, washing, and death, suggesting a shared mythology route that stretches across Celtic Europe. This mythical being has captivated the Irish imagination for centuries, evolving from its ancient folkloric roots into a powerful cultural symbol that bridges between the worlds of the living and the dead. Historians have traced the first documented stories of the Banshee as far back as the 8th century, placing the legend amongst the oldest of Ireland's supernatural traditions. These early accounts were firmly rooted in pre-Christian Celtic beliefs about the interconnection between the mortal world and the realm of spirits and fairies. It is said that if you were to see or hear the Banshee, you would then be filled with dread as you realized that very soon, one of your family members would be joining her in the land of the dead, with her wail so piercing and sorrowful that it immediately signals an impending passing. The wail acts as a warning for those who hear it, typically heard a few days before the upcoming death. This is both helpful and horrifying depending on the circumstances, either supplying a chance to get final goodbyes in order or a sudden realization that your time is up. It is due to these nuances that the Banshee is rarely seen as either good or evil. Like death itself, they are merely a presence. They do not cause harm themselves, and, if anything, are more of a messenger for death, a being that is able to travel between the plane of the living and the dead. However, according to many, it is not just anyone that the Banshee will show up for, as they are said to have strong connections to specific lineage. Traditional beliefs suggest that each true Irish family possesses its own personal Banshee, most commonly linked to families whose surnames begin with O or Mac, prefixes denoting ancient Gaelic lineages, which signifies descendant of or son of, respectively. So according to these beliefs, if you are Irish, but of Saxon or Norman descent instead, you'll get no such warning. This element of its folklore suggests that perhaps the Banshee were originally said to be the protectors of Ireland's traditional clan system, with each of the major families receiving their own messenger, although some consider their connections even more exclusive than that, with some suggesting that only the direct descents of the mythical race Milesians qualify for Banshee visits. The Milesians were a race said to be the final and most human-like invaders of Ireland in Irish mythology, believed to be the ancestors of the modern Irish people, descending from a figure named Mila Spania. Initially, this limited Banshee appearances to nobility and historically significant Irish families with verifiable Gaelic ancestry. However, as often is the case with folklore, the legend began to warp and change, allowing the Banshee to spread out beyond these particular families. In some stories, most notably in iterations that wanted to stray from old Celtic beliefs, the Banshee is the spirit of a human woman who has maintained a special connection with a particular family during her lifetime. This is not always said to be a family member though, as some have suggested that it could well have been a servant who had continued their protective nature into the afterlife. However, Irish society inevitably evolved and changed over the years as emigration and tradition expanded across the entire island. Eventually, the Banshee had extended to all Irish people regardless of their name, location, or social status. No longer was it an entity for the aristocrats. It was now part of the country's shared inheritance. Another figure often linked to the Banshee is the Morrigan, an ancient Irish goddess tied to war, fate and death. She's one of the more powerful and mysterious figures in Irish mythology and is said to appear on battlefields either to influence the outcome or to mark those who were about to die. She was known to take the form of a crow or a raven, and in some stories she's seen washing the blood-stained clothes or armor of fallen warriors, something that clearly echoes the image of the washerwoman later associated with the Banshee. The Morrigan doesn't cause death, but she announces it. Sometimes she gives warnings. Other times she's seen just before someone dies. Her presence is more of a sign than an action. While she and the Banshee are separate figures, the similarities between them are hard to ignore. Both are women connected to death, to cries of mourning, and to the idea of knowing what's coming before it happens. Some believe that the Banshee may have developed in part from older stories about the Morrigan, where myth and folklore slowly blurred, and the gods of legend became the spirits of local belief. The wail of a Banshee is described as being extraordinarily powerful, echoing through the wind for miles around. and although others may faintly hear it as it carries through the air, it is only the person whose the Banshee's warning is intended for who will be able to hear it at its full intensity. In fact, several stories have been told of those who have heard the Banshee's cry across oceans, with some said to be in other countries and yet still able to hear the warning in the air. This aspect of the legend, of course, grew when families scattered across the globe with little to no communication during the periods of mass immigration. This ability, although dark, was comforting in some ways, as no matter how far they got, the spirits of their homeland could still connect them all. The sound of the Banshee's wail is one of the most consistently described parts of the legend. Always unsettling, but not always the same. In most accounts, it's said to be high-pitched and drawn out, something between a cry, a scream, and a keen. The sound itself is said to begin as low, pleasant singing, gentle, almost comforting. But before long, it grows louder and sharper, rising in pitch until it becomes a full scream, often breaking into sobs or weeping. Some accounts suggest that the Banshee isn't just announcing death, but actively mourning it, as if she feels the grief herself. The shift in tone, from quiet sadness to anguished cries, has been interpreted by some as mirroring the emotional progression of grief itself, starting with disbelief, then confusion, before finally giving way to the raw force of realization as it fully sinks in. Some describe it as sharp and piercing, capable of freezing you in place, while others say it's soft, sorrowful, and almost melodic, like a mournful song carried on the wind. In a few stories, the sound is said to be strangely beautiful, even hypnotic, but with an overwhelming sense of grief behind it. The variation may come from different regions, or from the different forms she is said to take. Sometimes old and withered, other times young and beautiful. But what stays consistent is that the sound is a warning. Whether it's heard outside a window, across the fields, or near a body of water, the wail is always said to come just before news of a death. The Banshee's origins are heavily interwoven with traditional Irish mourning customs, particularly the practice of keening, pronounced keenu in Irish. In early Ireland and in parts of Scotland, professional female mourners known as keeners would sing lamentations at wakes and funerals, giving voice to the collective grief of the community. These performances were raw, emotional, and often improvised, considered by most as both a ritual and a release, and often improvised. The keeners would typically be paid in alcohol, although this drew criticism from religious authorities who considered it improper. According to later folklore, accepting payment for such a sacred act made these women sinners. Their punishment, it was said, was to become banshees after death, condemned to wail eternally for the dead as penance for their earthly transgressions. It is within this version of the story that the tradition of keening begins to blur with the supernatural, turning a human mourning practice into something otherworldly. However, not all versions agree with this concept, as in some accounts, banshees are said to be divine in origin, not fallen mortals, but the daughters of Manannán mac Lir, the Irish sea god. In one of the oldest stories, the first keening is said to have been performed by the goddess Bridget, a figure associated with poetry, fertility, healing, and wisdom. When her son was killed in battle, she cried out in sorrow over his body, and her lament was so powerful and moving that it became the model for the Keening tradition. The gods were said to be supernatural beings, associated with the other world and often described as possessing both power and beauty. This places the Banshee amongst the Aeshi, figures believed to descend from the Tuatha De Danann, a mythical race said to have inhabited Ireland before the arrival of the Milesians. According to medieval Irish texts, the Tuatha De Danann were eventually defeated and forced to retreat into the Shee, mounds or hollow hills scattered across the Irish landscape. Over time, these beings became known as People of the Hills, and their names, Ashi, became closely tied to what we now call fairies. Though the Banshee is not named in early accounts of the Tuatha De Danann, she is widely considered to have emerged from the same mythological system in some part, very much dependent on who is telling the story and at what point in history it was originally told. Some say she is a beautiful young woman, whilst others describe her as withered. In some traditions, she appears as a great beauty, wearing a shroud and covered in white. Her hair is said to be long and flowing red, contrasting against her pale skin. In other accounts, she is described to be an ethereal woman, wearing a long silver dress, matching her silver hair. It is these beautiful, more benevolent banshees that are said to correspond with strong family connections in life, now watching over their kinfolk in death. In this iteration, they still fill the air with their sorrowful songs, symbolizing an oncoming death, although here they are said to be filled with genuine concern and love for their mortal relatives. Contrasting this are the more horrifying manifestations that have come to dominate their stories. Here, the Banshee is described as having frightening red eyes, dressed in green with long white hair on her head. She is also described as an old woman dressed in black, with a veiled face and long scraggly grey hair. The size of her is another aspect that is said to differ from region to region, with some accounts claiming that she stands unnaturally tall, although in most accounts, she is actually described as being notably small in stature, between 1 to 4 feet in height. In her worst description, she is described as a woman carrying a bowl of blood, completely naked from the waist up, and with no head upon her shoulders. This iteration is often correlated with the angry tales of the Banshee, whose arrival comes with malice and ill intent rather than sorrow and concern. Connections have been made between the Banshee's extreme forms, with it being said that perhaps the beautiful form is for those who are to pass naturally and peacefully, whereas her more horrifying form is for warnings of violence and unexpected deaths. Outside of her physical appearance, she is also said to have a variety of different abilities and shapes, depending once more on the storyteller. Some stories state that the Banshee has the ability to shapeshift, transforming into animals commonly associated with death omens in Celtic tradition, such as weasels, hares, and crows. If you were to accidentally come across her in a human-like form, or if you were to somehow spot one, she would quickly evaporate into mist, disappearing from you, filling the air with a sound that is said to be strangely similar to birds flapping their wings. Some accounts even suggest that the Banshees are able to manipulate the weather, claiming that they can control atmospheric conditions, often appearing during storms, using the natural chaos to amplify their warnings. This association is common in broader Celtic beliefs, as oftentimes supernatural beings were said to influence natural phenomena. An aspect that also connects to other Irish legends is the specific objects said to connect to a Banshee. It is said that if you were to find a comb, a common item in Irish folklore, in an unsuspecting place, you are to leave it alone, as this could, in fact, belong to a banshee, and by touching or taking it, you could bring great misfortune to you and your loved ones. It seems as though wherever the banshee tales originated, it had slowly become a mixture of ideas that had grown over time, incorporating elements from pre-Christian beliefs, medieval practices, and the usual transformation through oral storytelling and cultural shifts. Although, unlike many supernatural beings that inevitably fade over time due to continued urbanization, scientific discovery, and education, the banshee has remained consistent, retaining her place in Irish cultural consciousness, continuing to exist in contemporary storytelling, and remaining a symbol of Irish heritage. If you're still listening, I know you share my passion for folklore and urban legends. But to keep these stories coming, I need your help. For just £3 a month, you can ensure the show thrives, with shorter breaks between seasons and even more content created. As a Patreon subscriber, you'll unlock exclusive perks, including access to our bonus series, Modern Myths, giving you 8 additional episodes each season, featuring captivating tales such as The Hodag, The Dark Watchers, and many more. You'll also enjoy behind-the-scenes insights, discounts on merchandise, and access to our private community chat, where you can connect directly with me and other urban legend enthusiasts. And as an extra thank you, I randomly feature patrons in upcoming stories, so you could become part of the legends we discuss. Your support isn't just subscribing, it's joining a passionate community dedicated to keeping folklore alive. Your contribution directly fuels the research and production of this show. If you're ready to join, just click the Patreon link in our show notes to subscribe, and I'll see you there. But for now, back to the legend. One of the most widely cited historical banshee sightings comes from Lady Anne Fanshawe, an English woman who wrote about her experience in a memoir published in the late 17th century. The event took place in 1642, when she and her husband were staying at a friend's castle in County Clare. She wrote that she was woken in the night by a supernatural scream outside her window, and when she looked out, she saw a woman with long disheveled hair, wearing white and hovering just above the ground. The woman let out a second cry before disappearing. The next morning, Lady Fanshawe was told that a family member in the house had died during the night. She later described the figure as the most horrible and ghastly thing I ever beheld. And though she didn't actually use the word banshee, her account closely matches the traditional description. It's one of the earliest written records of a banshee-type figure and is often cited as evidence that belief in the banshee crossed class and cultural lines, even reaching English observers in Ireland during the 17th century. What's fascinating is that, while the banshee is often treated as a relic of Irish mythology, archived testimonies from the 20th century show that belief in this figure persisted well beyond the folkloric past you'd expect it to remain amongst. The National Folklore Collection at University College Dublin, particularly the material gathered during 1937 to 1938, contains dozens of documented accounts of apparent, real-life banshee encounters from across Ireland. In 1937, in the town of Aughrim, County Wicklow, a woman named Mrs. Danburn gave a detailed account of hearing the banshee. According to the report, The cry sounded like a child weeping, 3 sharp wails repeatedly in cycles. She also claimed to have even seen the Banshee, with the figure said to be combing her hair. This wasn't actually considered unusual in the area, especially for those holding the Byrne name, and the report of it suggests multiple people in the community had similar beliefs. In County Clare during the same 1937 to 1938 collection project, a student contributor wrote that 3 separate individuals claimed to have heard the Banshee just before someone in their circle died, emphasizing further that this remained a belief amongst the world as it changed. A separate account from mid-1930s County Clare, recorded during the university's fieldwork, tells of a man whose grandmother claimed she always knew when a death was coming due to the high-pitched, drawn-out cries she would hear in the days beforehand. She believed this was the sound of the Banshee, and she reportedly experienced it repeatedly over the years. Belief wasn't widespread, but it was far from obsolete, and these did not disappear after the 1930 study took place. In fact, between 1938 and 1940, UCD's Department of Irish Folklore followed their study by distributing a national questionnaire specifically asking about Banshee sightings. The responses suggest that people across Ireland still reported experiences with the figure, and some of the stories even date from the late 1940s and beyond. In 1985, folklorist Patricia Lysat published a comprehensive study titled The Banshee, a Study in Beliefs and Legend. Her research drew heavily from the National Folklore Collection and confirmed that, in places like County Clare, belief in the Banshee remained active well into the 20th century. She noted that these stories weren't just symbolic or metaphorical, and were often reported as literal experiences. Unlike many of the other death omens you will find across the globe, the Banshee seems to provide a service to those who can hear her. Her forewarning allows time not only for physical affairs to be put in order, but it also gives the family time to mentally prepare, say their goodbyes, and embrace their final moments. This reflects much of the Irish attitude towards death, with death very much being part of existence that should be acknowledged rather than an aspect we should shy away from. The Banshee works as a form of mediation between the two sides of life and death. It is a simple, memorable, and hauntingly beautiful concept that has proven its longevity over the years. It has survived colonization, Christianization, and modernization, still remaining amongst its culture to this very day. It has, of course, changed and adapted over time, which is always necessary for these folkloric characters to remain, although, interestingly, with how religious much of Ireland has become, the Banshee itself has remained separate from it. Its association with angels, devils, heaven and hell have stayed minimal, keeping it as a distinctively pre-Christian entity. She exists as a reminder of family connection and the importance some have to their bloodline and heritage, surviving generations and transcending even death's boundaries. Some have put forward ideas that suggest that sounds people once thought were the cries of a banshee may very well have come from something far more ordinary. One of the most common theories is that it was birds, specifically the barn owl. These incredible creatures found across Ireland let out a sharp, screeching call that in the dead of night can sound disturbingly like a woman wailing. And before the countryside was filled with cars or electric noise, a sudden sound like that in the dark could easily be taken as something otherworldly. There are other possibilities too. The scream of a vixen, a female fox, is another that gets mentioned a lot, and one that I hear most nights in London. It's high-pitched, drawn out, and genuinely unsettling. Some say it sounds even more human than the owl. In fact, when I first moved to this city, I remember jumping outside in the night, thinking a woman had screamed nearby, only to discover it was nothing but a vixen's call. Then, there are other noisy birds out there, like the tawny owl or the long-eared owl, both with haunting, echoing calls that travel far through quiet landscapes. It is likely that almost all of the Banshee stories are just that, stories. But you can imagine a believer sitting with someone already unwell and dying, hearing the call of a fox or an owl outside. And just what new meaning this otherwise innocuous sound could have. The Banshee has become a significant deathly symbol amongst the world, with her popularity opening doors to several aspects. She has been rewritten as comic book characters and used in video games. She's been depicted in film and television shows numerous times. The 2022 film, The Banshees of Inisherin, did not directly feature the entity itself, although her name was used due to its association with death, loss, folklore, and Irish cultural identity, all things heavily used within the film. Her name has even been picked up by the US military, with the XP-67 Moonbeam American fighter aircraft prototype being given the nickname Banshee, due to the distinctive wailing sound emitted from its engines. As happens often with these spookier-feeling urban legends, much of her nuance is forgotten in storytelling, with the focus now being more horror-based. Modern horror stories tend to mold the Banshee into a threatening entity rather than a harbinger of death for specific families. This has proven itself to be a consistent theme across the various beings existing amongst the mist of folklore, where their adaptations are hollowed out and flattened, ready for mass media consumption, where specific cultural significance is stripped away to fit a wider narrative. Although despite this, the core concept of the Banshee being a female entity whose wail is said to signal an approaching death has remained notably consistent throughout its retellings, preserving, at the very least, her main functions. The Banshee is, in her original being, a fairy, serving also as a screaming spirit or an omen of death. Although, on top of this, she has always represented a far more complex understanding of our mortality. She is deeply embedded in Irish cultural identity and family structures. From her old fairy days to her worldwide modern interpretations, the Banshee has demonstrated remarkable adaptability whilst maintaining a messenger of death. She embodies distinctive cultural values regarding family continuity, the significant bonds between generations, and the curious boundaries between the planes of the living and the dead. In a way, her being seen as a great beauty and also as a withered crone is a perfect reflection of our confused and nuanced feeling towards death. There is a necessary beauty in death, although it is also something we despise, fear, and work hard to avoid. It doesn't seem as though the story of the Banshee is going to disappear anytime soon. And although she may change as she continues to spread through folklore and storytelling, it seems as though her wailing will continue to echo through cultural consciousness for years to come, reminding us of the inevitability of death and the connections that bind our generations together, expanding beyond time and our mortal world.
Urban Legends is researched, written and produced by Luke Morgie, co-edited by Sophie Tickle, music by Billy Japp, with additional sounds from Storyblocks and Envato. If you liked what you heard and want to hear more, please like and review our show on your chosen podcast provider. This simple task is a big part of our show's continuation and growth. To access more chapters through our bonus material, early releases, ad-free content and more, become a patron by clicking the link in our show notes. To follow us on TikTok, Instagram, or YouTube, simply search Urban Legends Folklore or visit lukemordew.com/podcast. If you have more information or a correction on anything said, email us on luke@lukemordew.com. We aim to ensure that all information provided is accurate and up to date, and this remains a top priority.